This is the rating system that I will be using for this review. There are timestamps down below if you wish to hear me discuss particular aspects of the game. There will also obviously be spoilers. You have been warned. Pokemon Sword and Shield are arguably the most controversial and contentious Pokemon titles ever released. Before I get into the review, I would like to touch on some context surrounding the titles regarding this controversy. I feel this is necessary because it is pertinent information that puts the games into proper perspective. Pokemon was always a beloved handheld classic, but titles such as Colosseum, Gale of Darkness, and Pokemon Battle Revolution showcase what the classic handheld titles were capable of on much more powerful hardware, having the ability to bring the Pocket Monsters to life like nothing seen before. That fabled title was to finally arrive under the moniker Sword and Shield, and were technically Game Freak's second attempt at a console Pokemon experience, but we like to pretend that other one doesn't exist. The question that was on everybody's mind was, would they deliver? Not much information was known up until the monumental E3 2018 Treehouse demo, which gave everyone an in-depth look at the upcoming games. What was showcased, however, was a far cry from the concocted childhood dream Pokemon title inspired by the aforementioned console Pokemon games. Despite making a giant leap forward in terms of hardware capabilities, Sword and Shield, at first glance, betrayed that sentiment. It was extremely lackluster, with terrible, muddy textures, stiff and sometimes non-existent animations, bugs, and so on. It was a very disheartening presentation. That was only the beginning. Immediately after the presentation, it was revealed that the National Dex would not make a return. These would be the first games in the series to not have all Pokemon programmed and obtainable in the games. This sparked massive outrage that resulted in a movement called Bring Back National Dex, or bbnd for short. This had Pokemon fans protesting in the hopes that the decision to exclude some Pokemon could be reversed, giving rise to a counter movement born out of spite called Don't Bring Back National Dex, or DBBND. The producers of the game reassured that this would grant them additional resources to fully flesh out the remaining Pokemon, and even allow them to focus on game balance, which has been a recurrent issue in the series. However, these words fell on deaf ears, as they did not reflect what was seen in-game. There were minimal, if any, improvements, especially considering the generational shift from a handheld console to a dedicated home console, the Switch, which has access to significantly more technological resources than any past Nintendo console. This is further exacerbated by the fact that Pokemon is the highest grossing media franchise on the planet. Time went by and eventually the games were leaked, and to everyone's surprise, it turned out that only 400 Pokemon made it into the final game, which is just under half of all of the species. This was never officially announced. It was also revealed that the Pokemon assets, like the models and animations, were reused from the 3DS games. This means that a significant bulk of the work, being the Pokemon themselves, was far less demanding than what was required from past titles. This also means that Game Freak could pump these spare resources into other areas of the games. Did Game Freak take full advantage of this opportunity? Let's take a look. The game starts off a lot more cinematic than past titles, thanks to the hardware jump. It starts off in a huge stadium with a roaring crowd. Not all is well, however, as one of the glaring weaknesses of the game rears its ugly head early. There's no voice acting. This heavily detracts from the cinematic nature of the game. It is extremely distracting and shatters immersion as characters' lips move with no sound coming out of them. The beginning is especially jarring as Rose's movements pause between each sentence as he waits for you to make an input. The Legend of Zelda series recently introduced voice acting, which paid dividends for what little story that game had to offer. Even the mobile spin-off Pokemon title, Pokemon Masters, takes advantage of what voice acting has to offer. It fleshes out a character in a way that is not possible otherwise. Characters are very important when it comes to media, especially in the RPG genre, which is what Pokemon Sword and Shield are. Many of the cutscenes feel flat and lifeless as a result of the omission of voice acting. Leon also commands his Charizard to Dynamax, but then proceeds to Gigantamax, which sheds a light on the convolution of the mechanic as a whole, but we'll get to that in a bit. After the opening cinematic, the game plays out like it has for the past 2 decades. You are a kid in a small town, you have a mum, dad is absent, you have a rival, a professor, and you are given your very first Pokemon between a selection of fire, grass, or water. It's rather disappointing to see that Game Freak is still unwilling to shake up this formula in any significant way. The pace is also still extremely slow, especially for veteran players. Game Freak at least attempted to address this by allowing some tutorial skips like the catch tutorial, which I admit is a much needed and appreciated addition. However, Game Freak fails to properly implement very basic quality of life features. One of the main criticisms of the last generation, Pokemon Sun and Moon, was that there was way too many cutscenes. On top of that, there was no way to skip any of them, which means you were forced to sit through every single one, every single time.
Nebby! Get in the fucking bag!
Game Freak attempted to correct this by adding a skip cutscene option. This, unfortunately, has many flaws. First, as long as the option is on, it will auto-skip every single cinematic cutscene in the game, such as the one seen in the intro. Usually developers give you the option to skip cutscenes you want to skip. Game Freak makes the decision for you every time. Another issue is that you still can't skip the text-based cutscenes. The cinematic cutscenes can be skipped, but there's only a select handful of those in the entire game. The significantly more common cutscenes that want to be skipped cannot be. The same issue that plagued Sun and Moon Return to Sword and Shield. Speaking of cutscenes, the beginning of the game is completely filled with them. You are stopped by Hop around almost every single corner. This slows the pace of the game to a crawl and is a serious drag. Hop, your rival, introduces you to his big brother Leon. He is Galar's very own unbeatable champion. Leon, as opposed to the region professor, is the one who gives you your first Pokemon, a first for the series. Hop picks the starter that is weak to yours, which makes him significantly less of a challenge, greatly contributing to the lack of difficulty present in the game. You meet Sonia, who is the regional professor's self-appointed assistant, and you eventually meet the professor herself, Magnolia. Magnolia introduces you to the main gimmick of the generation, Dynamax. An object conveniently falls from the sky at the perfect time and miraculously grants the ability to Dynamax. They're called wishing stars and can be used to Dynamax your Pokemon when retrofitted to a Dynamax band. A huge amount of power is just handed to you without the need to accomplish anything. It would have been more satisfying to earn the ability to Dynamax as opposed to receiving it as a handout. Leon then endorses you so that you can partake in the gym challenge. After you make it through the maze of cutscenes, you arrive to the wild area. In here you find dens where you can battle Dynamax Pokemon with up to 3 other trainers. You also find a wide assortment of Pokemon, some of which are extremely strong. You're physically incapable of capturing these Pokemon, however, as the game prevents it unless you have a certain number of badges. This removes almost all incentive to interact with a stronger Pokemon, since you can't capture them anyways. Instead of locking Pokemon behind badges, they should have allowed you to catch them whenever, but make them fail to obey you unless you have the correct number of badges. Similar to what happens when you get a strong traded Pokemon. This way you would have further incentive to interact with a larger array of species and would make the risk of running into the stronger monsters worth it, with the possibility of adding them to your team if you successfully catch them. Once you have your fun in the wild area, you have to head over to Motostoke in order to sign up as a contender for the gym challenge with the champion's endorsement. Once you pick a number and you get fully registered, your adventure truly starts. And unfortunately, it's not much of an adventure. The gym challenge is really your only priority throughout the entire game. Game Freak did a fantastic job with the gyms this time around, probably the best they've ever been, but that's all the game has to offer in terms of a plot. The actual plot is taken care of by Leon. You hear a large explosion in the distance and you want to investigate? Too bad. Leon, Galar's unbeatable champion, will take care of it for you. He does this several times throughout the game. Leon has a more interesting campaign run than you do. It made me wish I was playing as Leon instead of the player character. Leon is the true main character of Sword and Shield. I enjoy having the champion more involved with the story, but Leon was perhaps too involved, effectively sucking a majority of the fun out of the game. Most pieces of plot development arise through interactions with Sonia, although they leave a lot to be desired. You delve into a bit of lore, and you even learn that the true history of the region was hidden and altered. This is pretty interesting, and brings to light many questions like, why was the truth kept secret, and by who? You unfortunately never get any answers as the plot point is dropped almost as fast as it comes up. While Leon is busy playing the game for you, you instead proceed with your gym challenge until you get all 8 badges to be qualified for the Pokemon League. Instead of the Elite Four, this time around you participate in a tournament style challenge, making your way through until you reach the championship match where you face off against Leon. Before that, you have to participate in an odd fetch quest to meet up with Leon, who went to Rose Tower for some mysterious reason. Once you reach Leon, he is having an important conversation with Chairman Rose. This is supposed to be a pivotal moment of the entire game, yet you are treated to still images with nothing but text. There's not even any music. It's the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. This was a great opportunity to learn more about Leon and Rose's characters, as well as fleshing out the story in an interesting and exciting way as we watch the climax of the plot unfold. Instead, you're left confused, especially with regards to Rose's motivations. To sum it up, apparently all energy in Galar will be exhausted in 1,000 years. There's literally no explanation for why this will be or what will cause this, or even if it's true or not. This makes it hard to understand what Rose is doing and why he feels so rushed to avert the tragedy, despite having hundreds of years to prepare for the worst. Leon refers to Rose's plan as madness, and rightfully so, wanting nothing to do with it. Leon is much more interested in the championship match with the player the following day, but Leon, being a stand-up guy, insists he will help Rose with his plans, but only after his anticipated match. This apparently wasn't a satisfying enough compromise for Rose because he proceeds with his plans regardless of Leon's wishes the following day, right before the championship match. Rose's plan is to bring back the Darkest Day, which was a prophecy you learned about earlier with Sonia. The Darkest Day was a storm that covered Galar about 3,000 years ago. It causes a leakage of Dynamax energy that forces Pokemon to Dynamax, but also has the unfortunate side effect of having the giant Pokemon go berserk. How is this supposed to alter the Galarian energy crisis that's alleged to occur within 1,000 years? Who knows? There were instances of wild Dynamax Pokemon going berserk earlier in the game. It's one of the many side quests that Leon did instead of you, once again having a more enjoyable adventure than the actual player. These events were apparently caused by Rose. Rose then says that his hand was forced by Leon to bring about the Darkest Day because Leon refused to listen. Except that Leon was actually willing to hear him out after the championship match was finished. All Rose had to do was wait a couple of hours and he would have had Leon's undivided attention. Rose also stated the energy for the Darkest Day was too much to contain, and he was in a pickle because of it. So not only is Rose extremely impatient, he's also incompetent. Dynamax energy begins to leak out around Galar. While Leon continues to play the game by handling the situation, you, the player, actually get to partake in the plot this time around. You start off by investigating the slumbering Weald in the search of the hero Pokemon that stopped the Darkest Day all those thousands of years ago. You obtain a relic of the Pokemon, but the Pokemon themselves are nowhere in sight. You head back to Hammerlock where Oleana, Rose's trusted secretary, begs for your help to stop Mr. Rose. She fears the underground power plant where Rose is located will collapse. She also informs you that Rose has awakened a Pokemon called Eternatus that emits energy that makes Dynamaxing possible. What is Eternatus exactly? Where did it come from? And how did Rose get his hands on it? Many pressing questions. You head down to meet up with Rose where he claims that he needs to provide Galar with limitless energy to ensure everlasting prosperity, and for some reason, the Darkest Day was the only means to accomplish such a task. Rose has apparently been giving Wishing Star to Eternatus. These are the objects that landed in your lap earlier on, and Bede, one of Rose's assistants, was tasked with collecting them for this very reason. It appears that Eternatus was encased in some kind of egg-like structure. Rose confesses the odd things happening around the region were a result of him trying to awaken Eternatus. So it seems he found Eternatus debilitated, and that's it. There's no explanation of where he found Eternatus, why it was asleep, why it was in the egg, how he knew where to find it, why it woke up suddenly, why he was unable to contain it. All of this vital information is just pushed to the side as you engage in an extremely easy battle versus Chairman Rose. I literally one-shot every single one of his Pokemon. It was really pathetic. After you beat him, he claims he actually wanted to see the championship match and apologized for ruining everything. If that were truly the case, then he could have just postponed his nonsensical plan for a few minutes. Leon rushed to assist Rose by attempting to catch Eternatus. Again, it would have made more logical sense for Rose to simply wait for the match that he himself stated he wanted to bear witness in order to possibly obtain Leon's support without everything blowing up in his face. You move up to the roof where Leon is facing off against the mysterious Eternatus Pokemon, and, to my surprise, fails to capture it. Leon so far has been established as, well, undefeatable, and perfect in basically every way. He ran through any challenges that he came across up until this point. It probably doesn't help that he used a Pokeball of all things. A noob move for sure. The crappy Pokeball bursts open, because of course it does, and this somehow renders Leon unable to continue. The concussive force, I guess, took him out. Finally, now that the unbeatable champion is out of the way, it's the player's time to shine. After you clap Eternatus, he goes berserk and proceeds to Eternamax. That's right, there's a third form of the same thing, but we'll get to it. In the fight, you are prevented from using any Pokemon attacks due to a mysterious power, while Eternatus stands idle storing energy. Then Hob remembers that the two of you have the ancient hero relics, and proposes you use them in the hopes that it will magically do something. Turns out Hop was right, as the two items somehow awaken the legendary dogs from their slumber in the slumbering Weald, despite having no effects moments earlier. The dogs are also able to fly or teleport, and proceed to join both the player character and Hop right before Eternatus has the chance to decimate them. The two relics are randomly restored and brings the dogs to their true form. There's a pretty sweet transition from the cinematic to the battle, which I really appreciate. A raid style fight commences with help from the legendary dogs, which renders the otherwise challenging battle mundane and spammy. Simply click the A button until his health is depleted. then throw any Pokeball as it will work like a Master Ball without fail. And that's it. Crisis averted and the world is saved. The dogs jump away and it cuts to black. Extremely underwhelming conclusion to an already underwhelming campaign. Nothing really happens from the first time you register for the gym challenge to the championship match against Leon. You come across some ruins here and there and you have a few discussions with Sonia, and that's about it regarding the plot. The whole game is pretty much just the gym challenge with the world-threatening event tacked on at the end. As I said earlier, the gym challenge this time around is really amazing, the best it's ever been. But the gym challenge is always only supposed to be the B plot, while the larger story unfolds in front of you. There really was no unfolding this time around, since Leon handles any obstacle and insists you stick to your measly gym challenge while he saves the world. The gym portion of the game doesn't have to be relegated to the B plot, but that's just how Game Freak treats it. Sword and Shield are no exception. After you save the world, the championship match is rescheduled to 3 days later. I will admit that this was the most highly anticipated championship fight I've ever experienced in a Pokemon game, and I was actually quite nervous going in. This nervousness was mostly attributed to my self-made restrictions I placed upon myself in order to have a more enjoyable experience, but it was hype nonetheless. I barely came out on top, and finally defeated the undefeatable, and then the game ends. I believe the campaign would have been significantly stronger if they just focused on the gym challenge aspect more by fleshing it out. I remember reading leaked plots before the game dropped, one of which stated that Leon was boosted up by sponsors, but was a cheater. He was winning matches that were rigged, and Rose had a part to play in that as well. This brief synopsis of a fake leak is infinitely more interesting than the tacked together plot that Game Freak went with. The player character is just a side character in the Galar quest, a second fiddle to Leon until he is conveniently incapacitated so that the player can take the wheel for once. They should have found excuses to write Leon out of the story to give the player the opportunity to play the game, but instead he sticks around having a champion time while you're relegated to the B-plot. Don't get me wrong, I like Leon as a champion, and the fight with him was very satisfying. Perhaps if they made Leon the player character instead, the game would have been more interesting. The post-game is pretty abysmal. You basically go on a bunch of sequential identical quests where you need to take down Dynamax Pokemon in certain gyms. There are 2 new antagonists, arguably the worst designed characters in the game, who proclaim to be the new kings of Galar. They run around wreaking havoc by mysteriously forcing Pokemon to Dynamax. Their plan is to bring Galar under control of the royal lineage once again. They will achieve this by exposing the true nature of the legendary dogs, by forcing Pokemon to Dynamax. Actually no, the plan was to bombard the dogs with Galar particles. But what are Galar particles? What do they do exactly? How do they work? Where did they get them from? How is it administered? No clue. It's alluded that Galar particles are how the brothers were able to force Pokemon to Dynamax. In a throwaway line by Piers, he claims those random Pokemon were little experiments. Maybe they were testing the functionality of their Galar particle emitting weapon? Not only is no such weapon mentioned or brought up ever, but how would Piers possibly know that was the case? To me it seems like their little experiments were nothing more than redundant fluff to artificially pad out the epilogue play duration. The whole fetch quest of going stadium to stadium is completely unrelated to the brothers' true goal of framing the legendary dogs of atrocities by making them go berserk. The twins confess that it was their ancestors who revised history, like hiding the dog statues behind the mural, in an attempt to take credit by obscuring the truth. This caused the royals of Galar to be lauded and revered as heroes, even though they were manipulative liars who, even to present day, are attempting to obtain that same faux reverence that they recently lost due to the uncovering of recent events. They managed to successfully bombard Zamazenta with Galar particles, causing it to go berserk. The player character is tasked with calming it down, which it then tries to jump hop. Zacian comes to the rescue and stops Zamazenta, who proceeds to run away. The player is then given the opportunity to battle and catch the box legend. After that, you head back to the woods to catch up with Hop for the final battle. For the very first time, your rival actually captures a box legend and then fights you with it, which I thought was pretty sweet. This is followed by some pretty wholesome dialogue with a decently satisfying conclusion to Hop's character arc. That's the entirety of the story for Sword and Shield. I'm giving the story portion of the game an okay rating. Mostly in part because the gym challenge aspect was actually really well done, while just about everything else was subpar at best. The main story lacks cohesion and the narrative surrounding it is extremely muddled. The climax feels contrived and forced. Rose's character is butchered to meet the needs of the plot. The player character's exclusion from many of the story's key events also greatly holds it back. The story and the epilogue is equally as confusing, with the sudden inclusion of Galar particles alongside confusing motivations from the main antagonist. This would have been a great opportunity to dive deeper into the history of Galar, but instead, the player character is subjected to random raid battles that accomplish nothing narrative or plot-wise. The antagonistic basic twins are also uninspired, extremely one-dimensional, uninteresting, and overall unlikable. With the plot out of the way, let's get into the characters. I will start off with Leon since I've talked about him a fair amount already. As I've mentioned before, he's the center of attention in the game, stealing the spotlight at every opportunity. I like Leon as a character. He's confident and sure of himself. He wants to do the right thing. He reaches out and helps others, including the player character and his little brother. He's also highly competent and entirely dependable. I wish there was more intimate interactions between Leon and Hop, as Hop has a rough time for a bit, which we will get into. Leon could have been the light in the darkness for Hop, but we didn't get a chance to see anything like that. Leon is just too overpowered for his own good. He's literally referred to as the unbeatable champion, which suggests that he can't lose. There's nothing the player could have done that Leon couldn't have done better. Some could argue the only reason the player was able to catch Eternatus was because Leon worn him down for us, and the only reason the player succeeded is because of the legendary dogs assisting. Before then, Leon steamrolled through any presented challenge, leaving the player with nothing to do but to continue the gym challenge. He's a pretty impressive champion through and through, and I thoroughly enjoyed the battle with him. He never backs down from a challenge, no matter how hard, and even acknowledges that the player character added the strongest Pokemon to their party, which invokes excitement in him. He has a true champion's mentality. Hop is your rival. He's also extremely annoying, especially in the beginning. He makes up a majority of the text-based cutscenes and they cannot be skipped, which means he drags on, usually repeating the same thing, how he will be the best or other useless information. Hop is also one of the weakest rivals, simply because he chooses the starter weak to yours, so your first few initial encounters are trivialized. Hop does actually succeed in having a bit of an arc. Around near the halfway point, Hop starts to doubt himself and his capabilities when it comes to Pokemon training. He is challenged by Bede and proceeds to lose. Hop takes this loss extremely personal. Bede implants a seed of doubt that has Hop question his desires to become the best Pokemon trainer of all time. Hop is Leon's brother, which means he's the brother of the unbeatable champion. This places additional pressures onto Hop as he now has to meet high expectations placed onto him by his brother. He feels he needs to uphold the family name and or the honor in a sense. This is where I feel Leon needed to step in more to give his troubled little brother some much needed direction, to empower Hop and to reassure him that he doesn't need to satisfy any outstanding external expectations. He just needs to follow his own path. This would have been a great character-defining moment for both Leon and Hop, and would have made Hop's arc a lot more satisfying in the end. After Hop loses to Bede, he goes on a pretty nasty losing streak. He continues to lose to the player character, which honestly made me feel pretty bad after every time I crushed him, as opposed to satisfied. He loses to gym leaders, he lost to Rose, he even lost to one of the weirdos in the epilogue. This forces him to take a step back to reevaluate his priorities and motivations, and he eventually comes to the conclusion that he's not fit to be a Pokemon trainer. Hop had an odd obsession with imitating his brother as much as possible in the hopes of being successful. When you fight Hop in the Pokemon League, he even has the exact same intro as Leon, which I thought was a pretty cool touch. But it's not enough to just copy someone else's style or strategy. You need to develop your own unique identity that complements you as a person. That's the lesson that Hop was trying to master throughout his own journey. Hop is able to jump out from his brother's massive shadow looming over him, and is able to carve out his own path, even if it's a different path from that of his brother and the player character. Sonia is the catalyst used whenever the plot needs to be driven forward. She offers almost all of the exposition in the game that has to do with the overarching main plot, and that's about it. You learn that she went on her own Pokemon adventure back in the day, and was even a rival to Leon, but dropped out while Leon went on to be the greatest trainer in the region. Not all is sunshine and rainbows for Sonia. She is dealing with some very personal issues. She recognizes Leon's grand accomplishments and often compares them to herself, and feels dejected and worthless as a result, since she hasn't achieved any significant accomplishments of her own. This has her come across as passive-aggressive and snide towards Leon, perhaps due to an underlying jealousy. An old man in a house right outside the lab in Wedge Hertz hints that Leon and Sonia used to have a healthy rivalry, but fails to get into details. This does imply that the rivalry may have gone sour, which may be one of the reasons Sonia ended her gym challenge prematurely. Perhaps Leon was a love interest but fell for another girl? Or maybe Sonia just couldn't keep up. The old man's wife does mention that Leon never held back, even in practice matches. Maybe Leon was just too overwhelming for Sonia. We're sadly left with only speculation, as their relationship, both past and present, isn't explored in any meaningful way throughout the game. Which which is disappointing seeing as how there's a lot of potential interesting history between the two. Sonia's whole deal is that she wants to prove to everyone, including herself, that she's capable of great things, is competent, and has talent. She wants to unearth Galar's mysterious past in order to claim the finding of a lifetime to put her name on a pedestal. She yearns to elevate her social status, and fears she will grow old and wither without proving her worth. Sonia is actually a pretty dark and complex character underneath her bubbly exterior, even with the little bit that is revealed to us, which makes her wasted potential all the more frustrating. Magnolia steps down and Sonia supplants her, taking on the important role of regional professor. Sonia is the first character to assume this role during a campaign. This is a huge moment for Sonia, and is further complemented by a book that documents her many findings regarding the legend of Galar. She thanks the player character and Hop for helping her find her way, giving her insight into what she cherished and why. The 8 gym leaders are some of the more memorable ones as of late. This is thanks largely in part to their animations in-game, which are expressive and unique to each individual. That's right, the leaders actually have some high quality animations. Stuff like Raihan snapping a selfie before he Gigantamaxes his Pokemon is just so awesome. It makes you imagine a scenario where he would post the image on social media after securing a fat W, and makes you appreciate the character even more despite nothing like that being in the game itself. This is only possible because of the solid animations each trainer brings to the table. The lack of voice acting hurts for sure, and would have fleshed out each of them even more, and their involvement in the story is at an unfortunate bare minimum, with Piers as the exception. Despite these shortcomings, these new gym leaders are a welcomed addition to the series, and I will personally remember most of them for years to come. Rose is arguably the worst villain introduced to the series, if you can even call him that. There have been some stinkers in the past titles for sure, with some really stupid ideas and plan execution, but at least you could understand their motivations behind their stupid ideas and terrible plans. Rose wants to save Galar by destroying it. It's not clear how flooding the region in Dynamax energy is somehow supposed to avert an energy crisis within 1,000 years. Not to mention that it has the unfortunate side effect of unleashing tons of giant rampaging wild Pokemon, like something straight out of Attack on Titan. This has the opposite effect of what Rose is trying to accomplish. How did Rose even learn about Eternatus? Where did he find it? Why was Rose in such a rush to fix a problem that has a window of 1,000 years? His plan is just so incredibly idiotic, and his motivations are contradicted by his actions. I was unable to suspend my disbelief enough to the point where I could believe that Rose had exhausted every alternative course of action, and had no choice but to go with the one he went with. It feels more like Rose did what he did so that the stakes could be artificially increased in order for the campaign to have a grand conclusion, instead of having a character act organically of their own accord. Rose is nothing but a plot device, which is unfortunate because he was an interesting character up until the very end. He was established as a very charismatic, competent, and even brilliant man. Not only was he the chairman of the Gym Challenge, but he procured a monopoly on power distribution in Galar with his company, Macrocosmos. He's no idiot, yet his actions at the end of the game suggest otherwise. When he wasn't acting as the chairman, he would go out in his hilarious civilian attire, donning a cap and shades with a pair of polka dot short shorts. This is in stark contrast to his more serious business-oriented suit, and makes him come across as more lax and comical in nature. It's never really explained why he dresses this way, but it's funny regardless. He has an odd moment with Bede where he seems to forget who Bede is, despite taking Bede in at a young age and taking care of him. He's Bede's surrogate father. He gave Bede his very first Pokemon, and he even endorsed him for the Gym Challenge. It's established that Oleana asked Bede to collect wishing stars for Rose in order to give to Eternatus to enact his Darkest Day plan, which is of the utmost priority and importance to Rose. He may not have explicitly given the order to Bede himself, most likely enlisting Oleana's help due to being too busy, but he at the very least knew about it, so it's extremely confusing how or why he would momentarily forget who Bede was. Perhaps Rose has some kind of underlying mental deficiency which might be attributed to his extreme lapse of rational judgment later on in the story, or maybe Rose simply doesn't care much about Bede and is just using him to obtain his ultimate objective. When Bede attempts to destroy the mural, Rose genuinely looks disappointed, which would suggest emotional investment on Rose's part in his relationship with Bede. Rose's fate is ambiguous. It's mentioned in a throwaway line that after the Eternatus event, he turned himself in. A flaccid end to a flaccid character. Speaking of Bede, he's one of the 3 rivals in the game. He's rude, arrogant, condescending, and cocky to the point of being narcissistic. Bede is actually one of the better characters in the game. as it's very satisfying to blow him up in battle. So it's tragic when he is practically deleted from the story in the second half. He starts off as a giant asshole who has an endorsement even more prestigious than the unbeatable champion, the chairman himself. He's very full of himself, leading to him overestimating his abilities, which makes fighting against him and winning very satisfying. You learn early on that he's collecting wishing stars, although he doesn't specify why. The next time you see him, you learn that he's more than just the chairman's endorsee. They have a history, and you also learn that a huge motivation for Bede is to assist the chairman in any way that he can. One can deduce that Bede is collecting wishing stars for the sake of the chairman. After you collect your fourth badge, you run into Bede again, who is trying to destroy a historical mural in order to, you guessed it, collect wishing stars to gain the chairman's favor. It's unclear how destroying the painted wall will somehow grant Bede the wishing stars he's looking for, as later on when the wall falls there are no wishing stars, just a pair of statues that slightly drives the overarching plot forward with some exposition from Sonia. It makes no sense why Bede would do this, and he pays an exorbitant price for doing something so reckless that would have yielded 0 wishing star net gain in the end anyways. Did Bede know that there was a hollowed out section behind the mural, or were his actions simply a necessary convenience to drive the plot forward? I'm leaning towards the latter. After losing to the player character for the 3rd time in a row, he is confronted by Chairman Rose, who is disappointed in Bede and decides to revoke his endorsement, effectively disqualifying Bede from the Gym Challenge indefinitely. This is a devastating blow to Bede as a character. While his actions were questionable and selfish, completely disregarding the historical significance of the mural he was about to destroy, he was doing it to help the chairman. He is, however, crushed in battle, removed from the Gym Challenge, and worst of all, he disappoints the one person who has been driving Bede's motivations up to this point in the story. Bede should be beyond traumatized after this event, or so you would think. You run into Bede again shortly after, and he seems perfectly fine. In fact, he's motivated more than ever to continue helping the chairman, even though the chairman crushed his dreams. You have to give respect to Bede's resounding resilience and optimism considering the dire circumstance he finds himself in. He's willing to approach the chairman to ask for a second chance until the gym leader Opal approaches him and he decides to go with her instead of helping the chairman, and then disappears from the game until the very end in the Pokemon League. When you chat with Bede in the Pokemon League, he admits that the chairman completely disowned him for making a single mistake, which no one really seemed to care about in the end anyways. He then goes into a bit of detail about his experiences with Opal. Bede is a different character, and I would argue a worse one. He went from being overly confident, sure of himself, and dismissive, to weak, diffident, and submissive. Literally all of his recent development was off-screen, so it doesn't feel earned, and you aren't as sympathetic and invested in Bede as a result. Before you fight Bede for the last time, he wagered that if he lost, he would retire. But when he loses, the crowd pleads for him to not retire, so he doesn't. Bede is always too easily influenced / manipulated by somebody else, and this doesn't change. He's first manipulated by Rose / Oleana, then by Opal, and then by complete randoms in the crowd. He never makes important decisions for himself throughout the entire game. He just does what others tell him to do, which is disappointing. He didn't decide to become the next fairy gym leader on his own. He was coaxed by those around him. His cockiness that made him surprisingly likable and charming is washed away in the end and replaced with nothing that is as endearing or memorable, essentially killing the character. Marnie is the last of the 3 rivals and is an extremely underwhelming, underdeveloped, and largely inconsequential for the entirety of the game. She doesn't really do anything, and she doesn't have much of a character to go off of. She's essentially an excuse to include Team Yell, who are equally as disposable and the worst evil team introduced to the series. Leaked rumors posited that Marnie was some kind of runaway princess who wanted to take down the evil and corrupt organization run by Rose. The actual Marnie comes nowhere near as intriguing as that premise. She's just a girl that's there, and remains that way from beginning to end. You don't really learn why she's doing the gym challenge other than to become champion for herself. And the only reason I can think of Team Yell following her around is because she's Pierce's sister. Pierce is the leader of Team Yell, so Team Yell is basically just a bunch of weirdos obsessed with their boss's sister. Oleana is just as wooden and hollow as Marnie. She's Rose's assistant, is always by his side, and that's it. She seems to have the capability to flip her typical indifferent demeanor into one filled with intense rage. Oleana's animations in her battle have more character than her entire inclusion throughout the story, which speaks volumes to how little she has to offer. Her sole motivations are directly tied to the chairman's, similar to how Bede was in the beginning. They should have fleshed her out by diving deeper into macrocosmos. a large business conglomerate owned by Rose, whom she's the vice president of. They're very similar to Aether Foundation from Sun and Moon, but are way less significant to the overall story, and the player is only introduced to them in the end of the game where you fight off a bunch of them in order to reach Rose. Even though the Pokemon don't speak, a great amount of character can be derived from the designs, cries, and roles within the game. Speaking of the designs, they're really well done. In fact, my all-time favorite Pokemon ever comes from Gen 8. I also really appreciate all of the non-wild overworld Pokemon. The main allure of a Pokemon game is the Pokemon themselves, so seeing them sprawled out wherever you go is an excellent way to immerse the player into the world of Pokemon. To conclude the characters, some had decent arcs, some were ruined, and others were planks of wood. The designs for the most part are solid, especially the Pokemon. Overall, the characters are okay. The music was one of the few things I was looking forward to before the game dropped, and I would say I wasn't disappointed, for the most part. There are some straight bangers like Oleana's battle theme, Marnie's battle theme, and Eternatus's first encounter theme. I could go on, honestly. Some otherwise great tracks I feel were ruined with the inclusion of the doggo vocals. I mean, I get it, the box legends are doggos, but the dog/wolf vocals clash and distract more than contribute to making the piece better. The music does a great job of establishing the tone and feel within a given area. The wild area has some tracks that capture that Breath of the Wild aesthetic with the comic piano. Bagpipes serve up that Scottish feel, which ties into the inspiration behind the region, the UK. One of the essential contributing factors to the success of the gym challenge is thanks mostly in part to the music. It captures that epic scale that made me fall in love with the older Pokemon console titles. The music for the gym leaders is dynamic, meaning it changes throughout the course of the battle. It starts off very energetic, which gets you pumped up and excited for the battle that is about to unfold. When one of your Pokemon faints, the music tones down in energy, and the main melody is drowned out by a roaring bass, which does a great job at heightening tension, knowing that you're closer to possibly losing. When you finally reach the gym leader's last remaining Pokemon, the music shifts again, slowly building up in tempo as the crowd erupts into a chant. This is followed up by the gym leader Dynamaxing their Pokemon, significantly increasing their power and threat level. This was amplified in my run due to denying my ability to use Dynamax, which means the gym leader was a genuine threat, forcing me to make the best plays I could in order to come out on top. All of this is why the gym aspect of this game is the best it has ever been. Game Freak succeeded in making the gym challenge feel like a real sport of Galar, and for that, I commend them. Overall, the music is good, and is one of the best parts of Sword and Shield hands down. Now let's get into the actual game itself. It plays just like any other Pokemon game and has all of the elements present in past titles. With a few tweaks here and there, you no longer need to hold a button to run, as the character moves how you would expect them to. Tilt a bit to walk, tilt all the way to run. This is a great addition and makes traversing the game more enjoyable without having to break your thumb in the process. This is a far cry from the other Switch Pokemon title, Let's Go, where movement felt very rigid as opposed to the smoothness present in Sword and Shield. A change that was introduced in Let's Go unfortunately found its way into Sword and Shield, and that is permanent experience share. In past titles, experience share was always optional in order to cater to different kinds of playstyles. Typically, if you wanted to make things easier, you would turn it on, and if you wanted a bit more of a challenge, you would turn it off. Pokemon has always lacked a basic difficulty setting, so turning off experience share was seen as hard mode. Game Freak has made the decision for the player this time around by forcing experience share to be on at all times for the entire party. This has detrimental consequences to the games. First of which, it makes the games mind-numbingly easy. trivializing every encounter and removing basically any incentive from training any of your other Pokemon, seeing as how the game does this for you. To avoid over-leveling due to the experience share, it forced me to speed through the game while avoiding anything that gave additional experience. This means that I was forced to skip many new features of the game like raid battles and Pokejobs to avoid over-leveling and lobotomizing the game in the process. I also avoided wild battles almost entirely, which is unfortunate because overworld encounters is a nice addition they carried over from Let's Go that I never really got to play around with. Even foregoing these additional sources of experience, I still found myself over leveled during certain parts of the game. There is the option to box your entire team and just run around with a single Pokemon, but not only is this time consuming and tedious, you shouldn't be forced to jump through hoops that were not only not present in past titles, but placed there deliberately by the developers. That's called bad game design. In order to produce any semblance of challenge to circumvent the disastrous experience share system, I had to put in place some self-made restrictions, which were 1. Remove Pokemon Center healing. The game, unfortunately, fully heals you around almost every corner regardless, but there was some nice resource management required, and taking care of my own Pokemon was surprisingly rewarding. 2. No Dynamax, which is the premier gimmick of this generation that I will get into shortly. 3. No items during battle. And 4. Set battle style. Thankfully, this option was still available as shift style breaks the game. These restrictions actually made the game enjoyable and challenging, especially with regards to the gym leaders and their Dynamax Pokemon. Game Freak's recurrent design philosophy is to introduce a new battle gimmick each generation. First it was Mega Evolutions, a welcomed addition that breathed new life into some obscure and forgotten Pokemon. This was followed by Z moves, which were one-time use, terribly animated, super powerful attacks. The newest gimmick is Dynamax. I was unimpressed when it was first introduced since the Pokemon just get bigger, and my opinion has not really changed since then. The only good thing about Dynamax is that it makes the campaign more exhilarating and difficult, but only if you refuse to use the mechanic itself, which is ironic. That's the only thing I like about Dynamax. The mechanic itself is inherently broken, being banned from Smogon singles, banned in doubles, and even restricted in Ubers. A tier dedicated to the most broken things in the game. A testament to how absurdly powerful Dynamax actually is. This is because Dynamax makes the Pokemon extremely bulky by doubling its HP, making it almost impossible to one-shot said Pokemon, even with a 4x super effective attack. The Dynamax Pokemon is given access to Hyper Beam level attacks that cannot miss, that grant very beneficial bonus effects during the 3-turn duration of the power-up. Dynamax also makes some attacks outright fail, and the Pokemon cannot be removed from battle. This limits both strategy and counterplay when facing off against Dynamax. It can also be activated at any time with any Pokemon, which adds a surprise factor to the mechanic and makes it hard to play around. The Pokemon is also free to hold any item they wish. Dynamax has the ability to outright decide the result of the battle. Some Mega Evolutions were obscenely powerful as well, but it was limited to a select pool of Mons, and they had to sacrifice their health item. Dynamax has no such restrictions. I also find Dynamax unappealing because the Pokemon just gets bigger. Game Freak tried to address this with new Dynamax forms called Gigantamax, which is literally just giant Mega Evolutions, except almost every single Gigantamax form is extremely ugly, with very few exceptions. The only difference between Dynamax and Gigantamax is that Gigantamax grants a new form, it's limited to certain Pokemon, and their main stab gets a slight animation tweak with a different bonus effect. And that's it. There's a third transformation called Eternamax, but so far this is exclusive to Wild Eternatus. The mechanic as a whole is a confusing mess that gets stale pretty quickly, especially with regards to competitive battles. Each battle is decided by Dynamax as opposed to the player's skill. This makes the game feel more like a coin flip than a game of chess. Battles are focused more on Dynamax use than how the game is played. And finally, Dynamax trivializes every encounter in the main campaign if you do choose to use it, further contributing to the lack of challenge found in the game without self-made restrictions. Challenge is only derived from the player, not the developer, despite that being a developer's job, not the player's. Battles are still sluggish and slow, and feel virtually identical to their 3DS counterparts despite being on superior hardware with additional resources. Sword and Shield really do feel like a 3DS port a majority of the time. Temtem is a good example to show tiny tweaks that optimize performance and experience in battle. For example, instead of having status effects play one at a time, like in Sword and Shield, Temtem has them resolve at the same time. This may not seem like much, but it makes each encounter feel more responsive, concise, and speeds up interactions greatly. Other turn-based games, like Persona, allow you to fast-forward gameplay during battle, greatly speeding up the tempo of a fight if you so desire. Pokemon hasn't changed up the battle formula at all. It still plays exactly like it always has ever since the Game Boy days, making Sword and Shield feel dated and clunky. Majority of the animations are lacking. some attacks not even animated at all. This is because every single animation for old Pokemon were reused from past titles, despite the removal of half of all species and the promise of enhanced expression. This is not to say that all of the Pokemon animations are terrible. There are some impressive ones like Powerball. The inconsistency in the quality of the animations is dumbfounding. I can't believe that Double Kick, a move not even animated, is in the same game as Pyroball, one of the best looking Pokemon attacks I've ever seen. Guess that's what happens when you shove a bunch of 6-year-old low quality animations from the 3DS into your Switch game without revising or updating them to be appropriate for the console. The models are also exactly the same, with only a select few Pokemon receiving minor tweaks. The Pokemon models are not properly scaled, and seem to retain their 3DS proportions despite now being on a home console, which supports the 3DS port aspect of the game. This is disappointing as one of the main draws of a console Pokemon title was having the opportunity to see Pokemon size relative to one another. Something that a Game Boy simply couldn't accomplish was demonstrated perfectly on home consoles. Sword and Shield fails to capture this magic. It's odd that Game Freak introduced a mechanic where the Pokemon are gigantic, but somehow fail to scale the regular Pokemon properly. This shows a lack of care and attention to detail that was captured in much older games. The only reason I can surmise to explain why the Pokemon retain their 3DS proportions is because Game Freak are obsessed with a particular camera angle. It's an angle that emulates the one used in the handheld games, showing the back of your Pokemon in front of the opposing Pokemon. This angle would not be possible if the Pokemon, say Wailord, came out, because they would be too large and it just wouldn't work from the specific perspective that Game Freak insists on retaining, despite not translating to 3D very well. Game Freak was fine with omitting this absurd and unnecessary design restriction when introducing Dynamax, as the camera pans out accordingly to fit the massive Pokemon into the frame. This is not an issue at all in other console titles due to a dynamic camera that pans all around the battlefield. Sword and Shield also have a dynamic camera, but it always defaults to the Game Boy perspective at the start of every turn. It's a neat homage to the Game Boy days, but it has some major repercussions to the actual game that just aren't worth it. One of the things missing from current Pokemon games that was present in past titles, with regards to the Pokemon themselves, is nuance. Old Pokemon always made a return, but each game they felt new and fresh due to an overhaul in assets. They would get new sprites, some of the sprites being animated depending on the generation. Some creatures were familiar, but they still felt new all the same. The shift to 3D makes development easier as the same assets can be repurposed for new titles, but at the cost of nuance. A large portion of Sword and Shield isn't new. It's stuff we've seen for the past 6 years, and this takes away a bit of the magic of the region, especially for the first real attempt at a Pokemon console title. The Ami feature from XY, or Refresh in Sun and Moon, returns for the 3rd time in Pokemon Camp, and overall it's a downgrade. You can no longer feed or even pet your Pokemon like you could in the past. Instead, you are given toys like this stick, which you wave around in your Pokemon's face until they're fed up and attack, and a ball, which your Pokemon fetch and then bring back to you. Petting your Pokemon or feeding them by hand was a lot more personal and meaningful, and you were rewarded with some of the best animations in the series. The toy stripped this intimate experience and replaces it with a sterilized, watered down version that is less enjoyable. It's also prone to glitches and bugs, occasionally trapping Pokemon in infinite run cycle loops that they can't escape from, which completely shatters what little immersion that was gained. You can technically feed your Pokemon with the curry minigame, sort of. The Pokemon pretends to eat invisible curry while the player character eats the real stuff, which comes across as awkward and downright cruel. At least you're rewarded with a cute animation like in Pokemon Ami/Refresh. The curry minigame itself is like the Poffin minigame from Gen 4. Just like with those games, the appeal of making curry with the minigame wears off pretty quickly. Pokemon Camp was another feature that I skipped entirely thanks to the mandatory experience share, in order to avoid gaining additional experience that would strip difficulty and therefore lower enjoyability of the game. The concept of the Wild Area is the series' first encounter with a controllable camera. It took the franchise over 20 years, but they finally managed to do it, and it's honestly not very impressive. The Wild Area is one of the worst looking locations in the entire game. The textures used here are terrible, like the infamous trees, and despite there now being overworld Pokemon in the game, the Wild Area, at times, feels lifeless and barren due to the short render distance of the Pokemon. Pokemon only render when the player is within a very close range. This means that Pokemon pop in and out of existence as you run around in the wild area, which not only looks bad but has the game come across as unoptimized and cheap. It's a shame the dev team wasn't able to implement a more clever way to mask the pop-in or find a way to extend the range. The wild area itself is about as large as Hyrule Field from Ocarina of Time and about just as empty too. At least Hyrule Field had some secrets for you to uncover, incentivizing the player to explore in order to uncover all of them. The wild area has no such thing. It's nothing more than a very large route with a controllable camera that isn't very pretty to look at. Exploration doesn't yield any gain except for a few items strewn about. There are new species you could hunt for, but as addressed earlier, if the Pokemon is too high of a level, you cannot even catch them, so it defeats the purpose of interacting with them until you get the necessary badge. There are portals laid out everywhere that gives you access to raids that I will discuss later on. The wild area is a great concept, offering that open world feel that so many have desired for a Pokemon game, but it definitely needs a lot of work. Hopefully the next game is able to build off of the wild area as opposed to placing it into the game what seems like the last minute, as this is the only area with camera manipulation, and the wild area's overall presentation feels unfinished. While the wild area is a graphical disaster, the rest of the game doesn't look nearly as bad, with some areas actually looking like they belong on the Switch. Places like Balinlee are oozing with personality and are great to look at. Unfortunately, most towns are extremely tiny, so despite some of the locality looking great, they are mostly forgettable. Some towns are a bit larger, but are mostly empty and lifeless. This is in stark contrast to places like Castelia City and Black and White, who are populated with NPCs that brings a sense of life and energy not present in places like Winden from Sword and Shield. Towns are mostly memorable depending on how useful they are to the player. In past titles, you would always remember the town that the move relearner resided in, or where the move deleter was located in order to rid yourself of those pesky HMs. Thankfully, HMs are not present for the second generation in a row, with the taxi service taking care of flying and the bike taking care of surfing. These are great additions, and traversing the world of Pokemon has never been so streamlined. The move relearner and deleter have also been merged into one location, the Pokemon Center, which means you can travel just about anywhere to access these useful features. There's never any real reason to return to a town once you visited it for the first time, except for the towns that house customization stores. This is Game Freak's third iteration of trainer customization, and just like before, you can change your hair, eyes, and clothes to your own preference. A minor criticism that ends up being very annoying once your clothing collection gets larger is that you can't see the items in your list, only their names. So if you don't remember the name of your favorite shirt, you need to equip every single piece of clothing until you land on the correct one. Typically when playing with avatar customization in a game, the customization piece is usually displayed visually so you know what it looks like. The weirdest part is that Game Freak solved this problem back in X and Y, Game Freak's very first attempt at trainer customization. In X and Y, whenever you hovered over an item, it would show you exactly what that item looked like. This was very helpful when looking for a specific item without having to equip every single piece every single time. Sun and Moon suffer from the same issues found in Sword and Shield. Despite being the third iteration, the customization system in Sword and Shield is technically worse than it was in X and Y, due to not being as user-friendly. Exploration as a whole is extremely linear. Sword and Shield suffer from corridor syndrome, where majority of the game is nothing but straight lines. Spikemuth, one of the towns in the game, is quite literally just a straight line from beginning to end. There's no real exploration, and therefore no true sense of adventure to be found throughout the campaign. The older titles had large, sprawling caves and locations that required thought and effort to traverse successfully. These locations were separated into floors, each as big as the last. There were also some hidden areas where it wasn't immediately apparent how to reach or required story progression to gain access. Sword and Shield doesn't really have anything like this. The game only has 2 caves, both of which are just straight lines with very little diverting paths in between. The only verticality the game has to offer are ladders that bring you from one small area to another small area. These ladders also have the unfortunate side effect of freezing the game world whenever they're in use. This doesn't break the game or anything, but it certainly detracts from your immersion and investment in the world. The escape rope was changed into a key item in this game. At first I thought it was a cool idea, but this change actually lessens resource management. Not that it would have made much of a difference in Sword and Shield anyway, because you never have any reason to use the escape rope. This is because the entire game is extremely straightforward, a straight line from beginning to end. This is perfectly illustrated in Sword and Shield's final route. Victory Road, usually Usually the very last route in a Pokemon game is the final challenge before they leave for. Typically it's a difficult place to navigate as it requires you to bring along every skill you've learned up to that point. It's also flooded with strong wild Pokemon and trainers alike. The Victory Road in Sword and Shield is called Route 10. Aside from having some of the strongest trainers seen up to that point, it's just a straight line. It's an excellent representation of what Sword and Shield plays like for almost the entirety of its relatively short campaign. Fudj, a fellow content creator, sums up the linearity issue in Sword and Shield really well. I highly suggest you check out Fudj's stuff. He makes great videos. A link to the video I'm about to reference from him, as well as a link to his channel, will be in the description.
Unfortunately, we have not lost the linearity. I've said before that linearity in and of itself is not a problem, and I stand by that, but here's the thing. Most games that are linear in the way that Pokemon Sword and Shield is linear are linear because they have complex, deep, and interesting stories that they need to tell you. Games like Okami and The Last of Us that I talked about before, these games don't want you straying too far off the beaten path because they have a story to tell you, and that story is important. And even then, especially in the case of Okami, they still let you do a little bit of exploration and traversing the world on your own. Sword and Shield's story is not deep, complex, or interesting enough to justify how much it is boxing you into small areas with no opportunity to explore. Almost every single time you make it to a new major town, city, or location in this game, you're there, like you're stuck there. You have to do everything you can do there to satisfy the story before you can move on. Your paths out of that location are going to be blocked off in basically every direction apart from back. At no point can you ever journey ahead to the next route or town ahead of time and have your own little adventure. When you first stumble upon Pacific Log Town, it feels amazing because it's so tucked away from everything else and quite hard to get to and hard to find. And finding this whole new, pretty secretive area is really, really cool. This is the kind of thing that Pokemon Sword and Shield is missing, and in my opinion, this is the kind of thing that Pokemon has been missing for a while now. This sense of a cohesive, open world, a sense of genuine exploration, and not constantly being boxed off and forced into small areas. There's no town in Sword and Shield that is non-compulsory. You'll go everywhere and basically do everything the game wants you to do.
There's also a lot of empty space with nothing of substance to offer. I came across a giant hotel that was nothing but one giant empty floor, no hidden items, and barely any NPCs to interact with, none of which offered any useful items or advice. The game doesn't reward the time you invest to explore what little it has to offer. There's also a line of several houses in Winden that are a direct one-to-one copy-paste of one another, right down to the placement of garbage in the trash can. Tiny things like this make the world feel incredibly small, artificial, and inorganic. The post-game, gameplay-wise, is lacking in content. The raid battles during the epilogue aren't any different from raid battles you can experience in the wild area dens. After the epilogue, you finally gain access to the battle tower. Sword and Shield have one of the worst iterations of the battle tower. It's so unbelievably limited. They, for some reason, completely removed multi-battles, which was present in the battle tree in the recent titles. This is very disappointing because playing with friends in the battle tower was actually really fun. Multi-battles also allowed you to team up with the many different characters you came across on your journey, something you can no longer do in Sword and Shield. They removed the super formats in favor of a tier system. This is worse because the battle tower is brain dead easy for every single tier and doesn't get substantially more difficult in between the tiers, unlike the difference in past titles from regular to super. They also removed the awesome feature of recognizable and notable trainers from across the Pokemon franchise. The only super boss trainer in the battle tower is Leon, who is rocking different attire. Dynamax completely destroys the battle tower as Leon is one of the only trainers who is actually capable of Dynamaxing. And it's always the same Charizard, which makes Leon pathetically predictable. So you can easily run through any trainer you come across by blowing them up with your busted Dynamax Pokemon. There's way less Pokemon to play with as a result of the National Dex ban, as well as less Pokemon to play against. This battle tower is a horrible downgrade compared to the battle tree in every way. The only good thing I can say about the battle tower is that you can purchase mints with battle points, which allows you to change the active ability of your Pokemon. This is one of the few examples of exclusive Sword and Shield innovation that is sorely lacking. Other than the terrible battle tower, you're left with the Dex completion and shiny hunting.
Excelgor? Shiny Excelgor? Shiny Excelgor! Shiny Excelgor! Let's go!
The dex is way easier to complete due to the pool of available Pokemon being much smaller, and shiny hunting is actually worse than it was in Let's Go, as you can't see shiny Pokemon in the overworld, despite that not being a problem in Let's Go. You can also breed and train up competitive teams. A nice change that makes training easier is that supplements are no longer capped at 100 EVs per stat, and can now be used to max stats, which defeats the purpose of EV training against wild Pokemon so long as you have sufficient capital. Breeding functions the exact same, and the bottle cap system that maxes out IVs via hyper training makes a return, but you still need to max out your Pokemon's levels in order to use the bottle caps, which is extremely inconvenient, and you're better off just breeding Pokemon with IVs in mind. The overall gameplay experience is bad. There's very little improvements or innovation throughout, and there are quite a few regressions, which is just unacceptable for a series of over 2 decades of games to improve upon under their belt. The battles play out just as they always have. They are still sluggish and feel like the entire system was just ported over from the 3DS. A Wii game from 2006 has a more engaging and exciting battle system that makes every battle feel grand and important. I will concede that gym battles managed to capture this feeling with its atmospheric setting mixed with the dynamic music and high-stakes gameplay. Most things look better than they did on the 3DS thanks to the massive spike in hardware capabilities, allowing a native HD resolution of 1920 by 1080, but the game is capped at 30 FPS despite not being that technologically impressive, and even dips in some areas like in the wild area. Sword and Shield don't boast groundbreaking AI, they don't utilize physics, there's very little collision, the mechanics are extremely simple, the gameplay itself is actually quite static, the quality of the textures dips substantially in some areas, and the graphics as a whole are some of the weakest on the console, at least for a AAA title. The game doesn't look or feel like it's pushing the system at all, yet the performance is unimpressive regardless. The game removed all touchscreen capabilities, which makes it feel less intuitive than even Let's Go, which still has touch functionality intact. This is sorely missed, especially when playing with the Switch undocked, where having access to the built-in touchscreen would make the experience more enjoyable and accessible. Another awesome feature left behind from Let's Go is the ability for your Pokemon to follow you, a beloved staple from Heart Gold Soul Silver. Game Freak lets you not only have follow Pokemon, but they even allowed you to ride your own Pokemon, which was so awesome. And this Pokemon interactivity is my favorite part about the terrible Let's Go games. It's disappointing to see Game Freak omit the inclusion of this great feature. Game Freak let you ride your Pokemon in the retro Game Boy era routes, yet when they finally introduced their very first open area, they stripped the ability to ride your Pokemon or have them follow you. It honestly makes no sense why there are no follow Pokemon or rideable Pokemon in Sword and Shield. It's cool to see the bike return, other than the atrocious clown suit they force upon you whenever you ride it. I don't know why Game Freak insists on implementing these ugly ride uniforms. You've never needed to equip a clown suit in the past, and they dropped it in Let's Go, but then brought it back randomly for Sword and Shield. It seems like Game Freak just arbitrarily decide what to bring back and what to exclude depending on how they feel any given day. Most of the innovative features present in the game are just carried over from other titles, like the mobile PC box or overworld Pokemon, Pokemon interactions, exploration, the battle tower, the online, which we will get to. The post-game, trainer customization, and the amount of overall content is just simply worse in almost every way, progressing in quality from what was previously established in past titles. This is devastatingly disappointing, and hurts even more when considering how highly anticipated this game was and what this game could have been. There's an obscene amount of handholding. Due to the linear nature of the game, there's basically zero incentive to play through a second time, as each sequential save will play out exactly like the last, with little variance between them. This is because the game tells you where to go and when. Everyone will have near identical experiences while playing this game, because you're constantly forced into a box and prevented from exploring. There's nothing new or exciting to uncover for yourself. No thought is required when traversing, and the rails that you are put on from start to finish is generally insulting to the player's intelligence. The wild area grants some leeway, but it doesn't take long to see all of it, and when you do, there's nothing left. Although the HM system was flawed, it was a great tool used to generate secrets and hidden areas. Removing them has opened up the game to the player, but that leaves no room for discovery. It would be really cool if Game Freak implemented a requirement-based system for progression purposes, maybe requiring certain Pokemon or certain attacks to access new locations. Instead of forcing the player to teach Pokemon HM Cut, an extremely underwhelming and less than useful move, require the player to teach their Fire-type Pokemon a Fire-type move, to burn down a tree blocking a path. You see an item on a cliff that you can't reach? Require the player to use a flying type Pokemon with a flying type move. These are moves that your Pokemon learn naturally and are useful. It rewards the player for expanding their team by catching many different kinds of Pokemon. It rewards them for properly training their Pokemon. It rewards exploration, and the player gets the satisfaction of uncovering a secret that wasn't hand-fed to them by the game. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 does something similar to this effect. For example, if I want to interact with the spot, it requires a certain blade with certain skills. This would translate perfectly in a Pokemon game. Instead of requiring the HM move Dive, just require the player to have a water-type Pokemon, or a specific Pokemon that is established as an underwater guide. Maybe, when the proper requirements are met, it will give the player access to a huge, secret underwater cavern that has additional Galarian lore, and maybe even some ultra-rare Pokemon. This gives power and agency back to the player, elements that have been absent in the Pokemon franchise for quite some time now. This proposal sounds both exciting and fun. It pains me to admit that there's nothing remotely like this found within Sword and Shield. Sword and Shield are the very first Pokemon games where you need to pay additional cash in order to access its online features. This is a fault of Nintendo, not Game Freak. Nintendo have always had relatively terrible online functionality, and the Switch is unfortunately no exception despite now costing a subscription to play online. Game Freak perfected online with the Player Search System, or PSS, back in X and Y for the 3DS. You had quick and easy access to your friends, if I had any, allowing you to establish trades and battles with minimal issues. The GTS was also just one click away for your convenience. Speaking of GTS, it was removed from Sword and Shield in order to monetize it in Pokemon Home, but we'll put that aside for the time being. Everything you ever needed functionality-wise could be found tied up in a neat bow on the bottom screen. Ever since then, online functionality in Pokemon games has been steadily regressing in quality. Sun and Moon introduced the atrocity known as Festival Plaza, a convoluted maze that obscures you from your friend list. You instead see your friends randomly in the overworld, I think. You have access to a guest list, which is random people, I think. The fact that I don't even know how it works is a testament to how confusing Festival Plaza is. There's also a VIP list where I put my friends from my friend list due to it being difficult to connect with them because there is no friend list in-game to interact with. Game Freak managed to one-up themselves by making an even worse system than Festival Plaza. Meet Sword and Shield's YCOM and stamp-based system. This system has completely foregone any list interaction and instead uses a confusing and messy stamp-based system. How do you find your friend stamps? I have no clue. It's completely random. There is no way in-game to communicate with your friends directly to prompt for a trade or a battle or to meet up for a raid. You need to establish communication outside of the game in order to organize and arrange a connection. The only way to connect in-game is via a passcode. Be careful, however, because if the passcode is not unique enough, there's a high probability you will connect with a complete stranger. The system is so insanely and unnecessarily bad I don't even know how to properly express it with words. Knowing you have to pay in order to access this garbage just adds insult to injury. Trades are more or less the same as they have always been, asinine connectivity aside. Battles, however, have taken a massive blow with regards to 6-on-6. Pokemon Sword and Shield adopted yet another terrible Let's Go addition, the Battle Timer.
What? There's just no way. There is just no possible way. No.
After the timer?
Okay.
Wait. Oh. You win.
This game is fucking trash. Are you serious?
This isn't your typical timer. It gives you a total of 20 minutes, which seems generous at first until you realize that the timer counts down even during animations. It's not like a chess timer where each player would have access to a total of 20 minutes for their plays, where the timer would pause until the next player was able to make a move. It's 20 minutes total, animations and all. This means that it's an optimal strategy to run the timer with a stall team to win. This change alone is incredibly toxic and has killed any motivation for me to partake in full-fledged battles. This is one of my favorite things to do in a Pokemon game, so my disappointment was immeasurable, to say the least.
If it says no restrictions, why are you restricting the time?
Bro, think about it.
There's another online feature called the Victory Station where you partake in competitive battles in the Battle Stadium. The Battle Stadium utilizes the same tier-based system found in the Battle Tower, where where you start at Pokeball tier until you reach Master Ball. There's only 2 modes for single and double battles respectively. Singles has you select up to 3 Pokemon, while doubles you can bring in 4. The semi-competitive mode is actually kind of fun, until you realize that almost every single battle is decided by Dynamax, resulting in each match feeling similar from one to the next, decaying enjoyment at a much higher rate compared to previous titles. Not only is the pool of available Pokemon significantly smaller, but the attack pool was also limited, with many useful attacks being removed from the game. This severely limits the number of creative strategies otherwise possible. The dens in the wild area allow you to raid with up to 3 other players online. Sometimes I had difficulty connecting to anyone. The game would just time out, being unsuccessful in its attempt to establish a team. Once in the raid itself, the flaws of the battle system are more prevalent than ever. The gameplay slows to a crawl as you need to wait for each interaction to resolve, one at a time. This is exacerbated when weather comes into play, as each Pokemon weak to the weather is ticked each turn individually. This adds up turn after turn and feels like most of this could have been avoided with minor optimized tweaks to the battle system. When you are online in the wild area, the frames dip substantially. You are able to see other players in the wild area, but there is no option for you to invite your friends to join you in the wild area, which is a missed opportunity. Overall, the online is terrible. It's an embarrassing mess when compared to the PSS, and Game Freak should honestly be ashamed. Beloved features were removed, and the player is constantly restricted and prevented from having fun at every turn. It's great that Game Freak has made a ranked mode much more accessible than in the past, but their gimmick kills a majority of the enjoyment after a while due to it being incredibly over-centralizing. Connecting with friends should never be this difficult or inefficient. They streamlined this process in the past, so it's very frustrating being subjected to this terrible stamp system. The experience doesn't feel like a 2020 mainline Pokemon title on the strongest Nintendo console in existence at the moment. To conclude, Game Freak continues to play it extremely safe. 20 years later, and the Pokemon franchise refuses to evolve, which is ironic for a series focusing on monsters that continually evolve to get better. Despite all of the cuts that were made, Game Freak was unable to capitalize on the additional resources granted to them. I understand why Game Freak made the cuts that they did. It's a harrowing task to include so many different unique characters into a game that gets worse every subsequent installment. Sakurai experienced something similar with regards to trophies in Smash Ultimate. Trophies were completely removed, but a compromise was made where Sakurai dumped all of that development time into bringing back every single fighter from the game's inception up until Smash 4 on the Wii U. This is a fantastic compromise that I'm sure every single fan of the series would agree with. The trophies aren't even that important in the grand scheme of things, but Sakurai went above and beyond to ensure that no one would be disappointed by their exclusion. So what was the compromise for Sword and Shield? Keep in mind that the Pokemon aren't just random trophies, they're the lifeblood of the entire franchise, and over half of them are completely disregarded. Over 400 Pokemon, literally every single one being someone's favorite, were unusable in the game. Where was the compromise? The graphics? Well, no, because most assets like models and animations are completely reused, most of which are poor quality, let alone all of the awful textures found throughout the game. The online? Well, no, because the online system in Sword and Shield is borderline offensive. You get where I'm going with this. The overall game doesn't feel like the additional developmental resources gained from omitting over 400 Pokemon were invested elsewhere. I'm not going to pretend that developing a game is straightforward or easy. Issues arise all the time, but that's where Game Freak could have gained ground by being transparent with their consumers. Instead, it seemed like Game Freak was more interested in deceiving consumers. If it wasn't for the massive leak, no one would have known the true extent of the Dex cut. Most assumed that it would only be a handful of Pokemon. Game Freak also gave off this impression. I too thought there would be at least 500 Pokemon in Sword and Shield, so it came as a great surprise to learn that Sword and Shield would only have a total of 400, which is far less than what was available in Pokemon Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum that dropped over 13 years prior. At no point did Game Freak, or the Pokemon Company, express to the fans the true gravity of the cut. Game Freak made many excuses for the cut, like creating new models, and made promises like enhanced expression of the remaining Pokemon and making adjustments to the battle balance. Instead, they reused all of their old assets, and they introduced one of the most broken mechanics to the series, accomplishing the exact opposite of what they promised. I understand the cut, but from what I see, the cut was not justified. No compromise was made, and instead consumers are expected to pay more for less, since Switch titles have larger inherent price tags attached to them compared to 3DS titles. The worst part is that Game Freak got away with murder. However, the sales for Sword and Shield are conclusive. They reveal that the consumer base is complacent with paying more money for less content. This sets a precedent where Game Freak doesn't need to put in 100% to produce a commercially successful Pokemon game. People will buy it regardless of quality. Why do more when you can do less? As a standalone AAA title on the Switch, and the first true mainline Pokemon title to grace consoles, the expectations were sky high. Many children dreamed of this game to come to fruition many years ago, but if I learned anything from recent beloved franchises, it's that reality is often disappointing. Pokemon is, sadly, no exception. They failed miserably to meet those expectations. There are signs of being rushed present everywhere, from the infamous mouse cursors to the entirety of the wild area. It's clear that Game Freak were pressed for time, which is odd considering they only had to work with half of all Pokemon this time around. A majority of the assets for said Pokemon being reused from past installments. With all that being said, Pokemon Sword and Shield are bad games overall. Whew, that was quite the mouthful. This is my first in-depth review of this nature, so I would appreciate any and all feedback. What would you rate the game? Make sure to leave your thoughts down below in the comment section. If you liked what you saw, consider leaving a thumbs up. And if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. I wanted to quickly mention that I launched a Patreon. I know we're all going through some hard times right now. There's no obligation. If you're willing and able to go the extra mile with additional support, I would be beyond grateful. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. Thanks for watching.